Hey there everybody, it's markcrilley. I'm back with another video. I've been looking forward to doing this one for years, really. A video that brings together all my best advice about coloring and giving you something to look at while I give that advice. I've decided to draw or add color to a drawing of a strawberry, which I thought would allow me to demonstrate some of the different techniques. I'm using watercolor. Later on we'll be bringing in colored pencil. Let me just go ahead and fill in this first area here with a base layer of red. You will notice it is fairly pale, and indeed that's going to be one of the pieces of advice that we get to in just a moment. I've decided to do actually two sort of prefatory pieces of advice that are not really part of the overall counting system. What if I come up with 14 maybe of the official pieces of advice? And we're going to go ahead and get these first two out of the way right now. My number 0, let's call it, add color digitally. Now, I decided to bring this into the video even though this is not a video about digital coloring. I just thought if I don't get this in here at the start, the comment section is going to be filled with people saying, well, it's easy to avoid making mistakes in coloring if you just color digitally. Yes, that is indeed the case, but I'm not going to be talking so much about digital coloring today. Although I love digital coloring, I've been doing it since 1995. This is really my video about traditional coloring. And there is this other piece of advice that tends to be in every one of my videos, but I can't be sure that this isn't the first video for some of you watching, and this advice is 0.5. Study the color choices and coloring techniques of artists you admire. Do a copy of one of their illustrations to unlock their coloring secrets. This is indeed a popular piece of advice that I use for almost anything. Learn from the masters. Don't try to just learn all this stuff all by yourself, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Study from people that you admire. If you do careful copies of their work, they can really teach you almost everything. Just by trying to reproduce, the more you study what they're doing, the more you will begin to understand, oh yeah, they started with a pale layer here, and then they built on top with it on this other section of the drawing. It's worth trying at least one time to do a copy of an illustration by an artist that you admire. Of course, it's not plagiarism. You're not like claiming that you invented this all yourself. You're just doing it as artists have done for centuries. You're doing it as a learning exercise. Now, at last, we can get on to the real pieces of advice. And number 1 is this. Use high-quality paper. When using watercolor, thick paper is essential. I like smooth surface Bristol, but different artists have different preferences. And indeed, the paper that I'm working on right now is smooth surface Bristol. The company here in America, Strathmore, is what I tend to use. It's sold in pads of, in my case, I tend to buy the 11 by 14 size pads of 20 at a time, and just keep a stack of them here in my studio. Whenever I want to create a high quality piece of work, I use that paper. When you use office paper, or even something that claims that it's artist's paper, very often that stuff is very thin, and when you go on top of it, it just wrinkles up. We've all had this experience, right? And you're like, oh, I thought it was going to be so beautiful, but then, especially with watercolor, but I think even with other things like markers, thin paper, it can be pretty disastrous. And so that's, interestingly, before we even get into the color advice, I wanted to start with the paper, because sometimes, a bad paper choice is your undoing right from the beginning. All right, so let's move on now to number 2. Test your colors on a scrap piece of paper before applying them to your final artwork. The scrap paper and the final paper should be the same type of paper, and indeed, right now I have a scrap piece of paper that I can test my various watercolor on, and I did include there. Make sure it's the same type of paper, because different, colors show up differently on different types of paper. If you're thinking, well, this is scrap paper, I don't want to use good quality paper on it, you may make the mistake of accidentally, you know, getting one result on your scrap paper, and then you go to use your final paper and it looks completely different. Well, naturally, because if you used two different types of paper, that's going to happen. Bear with me here. I'm sort of mixing up a slightly darker shade to begin adding onto my strawberry here. Before I do that, though, let's get on to number 3. Try doing one or more rough versions of the entire picture to figure out your overall color scheme before moving on to the final art. This is especially important for a more ambitious piece. Maybe you're going to do like the front cover of a comic book or something. I wouldn't just, you know, jump in there hoping that I find the right colors at the outset. I would do a rough version in which you sort of figure out what kind of colors are going to look good. You know, test out. You may do a few different, really, and I'm talking rough, super rough. You don't have to put a lot of time into this. You just want to see what do these colors look like side by side, rather than trying to figure it all out while you're working on your finished illustration. Best to have a plan, I guess, is what I'm saying, and you can plan it out in very rough form. Something that never really sees the light of day, something that you don't intend to show to anyone. It's all just about, you know, making sure that you know what you're heading toward, having a game plan. And now we can move on to number 4. Work from light to dark. It's way easier to make a light color darker than to make a dark color lighter. And indeed, you see, I'm following my own advice, thank goodness. As I work on this illustration here, I started with quite a pale shade of red, and I'm building on top of it. Yeah, it's, you know, once you put a super dark color on there, it's very hard to work backwards from that, and especially if you are just getting started with coloring, I would say be a little tentative, start with something that's too pale, and work your way towards darker colors, rather than go straight in with a super dark shade of something and then it's too late. You've already committed to that, and there's kind of no undoing it. Let's move on now to number 5. If you've drawn something in pencil that already looks completely finished in black and white, it may already be too late to add color successfully. So hang on a second, I'll show you an example of what I mean. So this is a drawing that I did in a video a while back. I think it was about drawing the nose. I believe so. But I would never attempt to add color to this drawing because it looks so finished to me in black and white. And trying to get color on top of this pencil work is probably going to just mess it up, you know. And I suppose it's possible with very, very light shades of watercolor maybe. I could, if pressed, successfully add color to this, but I just would not want to, frankly, for fear of messing it up. And I'd say a lot of times, especially with young artists who are getting started, that's the problem, that you've taken a drawing that you completed and you did everything real nice and dark in pencil, you added all this shading, and then you try to go in and add color, and yeah, it's almost too late. If you can get something that doesn't look finished, like I would say this one that I did, again from another video, it's lighter, there's not so much shading in there, right, as had been the case with this. This lighter one looks like it's still open to the possibility of added color. So that is what I mean by that. And I've even continued really into advice number 6 here. Consider beginning to add color early in your process or midway through, rather than saving all the coloring until the end. Kind of an extrapolation from that first one. The problem of adding color too late in the process, I really do believe that if you can get the color in somewhere, well, like in this case, very early on, I had the pencil lines, but almost nothing else in terms of shading. I was really planning to get the color in as early as possible before fine-tuning things. And I've talked about this before in other videos. My theory is that it integrates the coloring into the drawing in a way that makes it more substantial than if you wait until the very end and then suddenly try to bring in color. It's almost like the color is an afterthought. Whereas if you bring in the color midway through or very early on, it becomes one of the foundational aspects of the illustration. And for me, there just are a lot of advantages in getting the color going sooner rather than later. But as is the case with all of these pieces of advice, lest anyone get the wrong idea, I do not mean to say that these are ironclad principles of art that everyone must obey for all time. No, far from it. Different people work in different ways, and for a lot of people, maybe adding color last is, especially in the comic book industry, very common to add all the color last. It can be fine. But if you find, let's say, that process is giving you trouble, consider the other way of adding color a little earlier in the process. See if it helps you. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. All right, let's move on then to number 7. If you plan to ink first before adding color, test to make sure your ink won't smear when the color goes on top of it. I often ink last, an approach worth trying if you've never done it before. So this is another area where things can go drastically wrong. If you have done a drawing in ink, especially water-soluble ink, which is fairly common among ordinary pens or markers, and then you try to go on top of it, and the color starts really smearing, and that, boy, within seconds you can just wreck an illustration that way. And it's a tragedy, really, because at that point it's almost too late to save it. Test that stuff out early. And, of course, there's a difference between the ink lines at the beginning when you first put them down. If you go right on top of that with color, almost inevitably it's going to smear. Got to let it dry. Even a waterproof ink needs a little time to dry. Then you go on top of it with your this is all on a test sheet of paper, and see if you can get that color on top of that ink without any smearing. Then you've done that on your safe scrap paper. You've made sure that you're in good shape for moving on to the finished thing. And you can see me here trying to build on top. We're going to talk about this later on, the adding layers of color rather than trying to get it all in a single swoop. Bear with me, because in a way I didn't anticipate how much I do sort of need to take breaks periodically to get some of this coloring done before I bring in the advice. So let's go back now to number 8. When using markers, test the colors first and let them completely dry, since the color often changes during the drying process. Those of you who use markers, look what I did, guys. I knew that would happen eventually. We're going to have to alter the shape of this this strawberry because I accidentally dragged the paper across. That's another piece of advice. When doing a video in which you print out the advice on sheets of paper, don't drag it across the surface of your watercolors. So there you go, guys. See if I can save the day. I think we'll be all right. You'll forgive me, won't you? Just this once. Anyway, yeah, those of you who use markers, you probably have this experience of the color of the marker is quite different sometimes after it dries compared to what it looked like when it was fresh on the paper. It tends to lighten, it seems to me. I think I'm right in saying that. It has a tendency towards lightening as it dries, as you might expect. But sometimes even the hue, the actual color itself seems to change a bit over time. So you do have to, if you're very concerned about getting an exact shade, test it out. Again, let it dry first to see what the final color is before you apply it to your finished artwork. I'm switching to a smaller brush here because I'm trying to get to the sort of seeds, and it requires a little more precision. All right, now I think we can move on to the next piece of advice, number 9. Beware of the color shown on the marker, casing, watercolor tube, etc. It can be radically different from the true color. Again, yes, I see this very frequently. Buy a marker that seems to, the color that they've printed on the label on the exterior of the marker is like, yes, this is exactly the color I need. And then sometimes the actual color is radically different, and you're like, what happened? I'm sure they're doing their best at the factory to emulate that color, but sometimes their best is not good enough. And that ink on the interior of the marker can be quite different. I have even gone so far as to tape my own piece of paper onto the exterior of the marker that shows the true color, because I keep making the mistake of expecting this marker to be the color that it claims to be. That its labeling claims it is. So yeah, that's definitely something that, by trial and error you learn to be a little suspicious of those labels. And speaking of which, I'm actually making further mistakes here. I'm going to have to clean this up here, if you see there, later on in the process. You're seeing the real messy Crilly here today. Let's move on now to number 10. Some markers in a factory set are, in my opinion, too dark. Just because someone decided to include them in a set doesn't mean you have to use them. I'm often surprised at how dark the shades are of certain colors, and I'm like, boy, I'm barely ever going to use this. It's so dark that it's going to read as black to the casual viewer. When I'm hoping for something that's more recognizable as, let's say, dark green. I've seen dark greens, dark blues that are so incredibly dark that there's no way the viewer will see them as green at all. It'll seem much closer to black. And occasionally you need that shade, but I'm a little surprised that people will include such dark shades as your sort of base set, which to me, I think, should be the fundamental colors that you are most likely to use on a day-to-day basis. Let's move on now to number 11. In many cases, layered colors are more beautiful than big, flat areas of color that came straight out of the tube. Pale colors can be layered successfully, while super dark colors leave no room for a second layer. And I keep coming back to this idea of the problems with dark colors. And if you've got a lot of very pale colors, you're able to build on top of them. You have somewhere to go. Whereas if you go right in with a really dark color, then you can't get a second layer on there. Now you see me like here in the area of these leaves. I'm layering, right? I started with a simple kind of green, but because it was pretty pale, I'm able to go on top of it and just make it more interesting. So straight out of the tube, tends to be an uncomplicated, flat color. Sometimes that's what you want, especially if you want a sort of clean, modern-looking type of cartooning, let's say, where it's sort of deliberately flat. But if you have never layered colors, you should at least try learning that skill, because for a lot of illustrations, like for example this one with the leaves, it's the layering that's making the leaves on the strawberry look more convincingly real. And that layering is only possible because I started with very light colors and I had somewhere to go on top in terms of building it up. Okay, well, we're getting closer to final stuff. I think what I'm going to do, though, is let this dry, and I'm going to switch to colored pencils as I give out the final pieces of advice in this video. All right, so I'm coming in with colored pencil here to begin adding a bit of shading on top of the watercolor, as so often I do. And I'm a little torn with this video in terms of how specific to go with my advice. There's a lot of advice I can give that's specific to watercolors or to colored pencils. I think I'm going to save that for another video. This is more sort of the general advice, specifically geared towards, avoiding the problem of ruining a drawing when you add color. So please forgive me if I don't talk too much in detail about colored pencils or watercolors. Watch this space. I will hopefully be able to do a video like that in the months ahead. Let's move on now to number 12 on my list of advice here. If you have never done color mixing, combining blue and yellow to make green, etc., give it a try. A custom-made orange can be more subtle than the shade that comes out of the factory. Combing? I do apologize. This is supposed to be combining. Ugh. Anyway, color mixing, it's such a basic thing. They teach it to us in kindergarten almost, blue and yellow makes green. It's worth playing around with that. It isn't just for little kids. It is indeed something that professional artists are doing all the time. And I do remember using when I was in college, I was using a straight from the tube orange to paint an orange, the fruit, right? And my teacher back then, David Small, came along and said, hey, that straight out of the tube orange is not going to be as interesting as an orange that you mix up yourself using yellow and red. And he actually took all of these secondary colors like purple and green and so forth and almost took them away from me and said, here you go, blue, right, red, yellow, black and white, here's your colors, this is all you can work with now. And it was kind of a revelation to me, and it's worth having that in your bag of tricks, the ability to mix up the colors the old-fashioned way. Sometimes it'll give you a better or a more interesting shade of color than if you just used the color that came straight out of the tube. Let's move on now to number 13, which puts us almost to the end of my list here. There's nothing wrong with mixed media. Try combining, hey, I spelled it right this time, what do you know? Try combining markers with colored pencils, watercolors with pastels, etc. You can see me doing mixed media right now. Just know that you don't have to try to get all of your effects with markers. I think there's a lot of effects that are very hard to get with markers, for example. And I've been using mixed media for years, sort of leaning on each type of media for the thing that it does best. Colored pencil, for example, as I'm doing right now, is great for detail work. You get the sharpen that pencil, you can get all these tiny little seeds or whatever. But in terms of creating a base layer of red, very time-consuming, and maybe I'm struggling to cover up the white of the page because there's a certain texture, and the colored pencil, short of pressing down with all my might, is not going to give me that base layer that is such a natural thing when you do it with watercolor or markers. So if you can afford to have multiple types of coloring tools, give mixed media a try. And you may notice that there's no piece of advice in here that's about talking about the quality of your materials. I was tempted to say use the highest quality materials that you can afford, but I just felt, a lot of people just blow way too much money on art supplies. Art supplies can be very expensive, and I just don't like the idea of people going bankrupt over art supplies. I think you can actually, I would say get at least halfway decent art supplies. You don't need top of the line. I just sort of like, maybe my philosophy of life. I don't like the idea of you needing to blow a lot of money in order to be a good artist. I think that you can get there with relatively inexpensive art supplies. Well, we are coming up to the very last of my pieces of advice, but before I do that, I think I need to do a little time lapse as I complete my color work on this strawberry, and then we're going to be back with the very last on my list of pieces of advice relating to coloring. Alright, so you can see I put a lot of extra time in there. I'd say at least a half an hour adding finishing touches with colored pencil, moving back in with watercolor, sometimes even dabbing things away. You can add water to watercolor and use a tissue or something to sort of pick a little bit back up off the paper. Hard to completely erase watercolor, but you can lighten it up a little bit that way. Anyway, we can now finally move on to the final piece of advice, and that is this one, number 14, for highlights. Try using white gouache. Everyone knows I love white gouache. Even just a few touches of it can make a huge difference. I find that it needs to be among the last steps in the process, and indeed I have saved it for the last step in this process. And this is what a tube of white gouache looks like. I'm using Winsor & Newton. This stuff is not cheap, I'll be honest. I can't remember exactly what it costs, but it's. I feel it's worth it. I've tried an inexpensive white gouache, and it just doesn't come off onto the paper the same way. So, in spite of my desire to keep it inexpensive, I would say in the realm of white gouache, maybe you do have to break open the wallet and go for something a little nicer. But you can see me using the white gouache to add these little highlights, and especially in an illustration of a strawberry, that little glimmer of light as it pops off of the surface, the shiny surface of the strawberry, makes a huge difference. And as I sort of said in my piece of advice, it's surprising how a little goes a long way. You don't really have to have loads and loads of it. You can just sort of put in a few drops here and there. You don't want to overdo it. But I think you're seeing already a kind of an illusion of, the glimmer of light as it hits that surface can make a surprisingly big difference. And I think maybe that's going to bring us towards the end of this video. Let me go ahead and grab my books so that I can thank anyone who has supported me by getting them. The Realism Challenge, this is definitely the book that contains the most instruction that's like what you saw in this video. But we also have The Drawing Lesson, my graphic novel that teaches you how to draw, Mastering Manga 1, 2, and 3, and my latest book, Manga Art. The very latest book is, of course, called Chibi. Hope to have a copy of that. It's taking a little while, but let's go ahead and lay down this brush. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.